Wonderful. I'm going to give people just one more minute to get in the door, and then we'll get started. I'm impressed after the lunch hour how prompt everyone still is. It's wonderful. Okay, great. So I will just say good afternoon and thank you to everyone for joining us today. My name is Emily Corey Pryor. I'm Executive Director of Data2X. And first and foremost, I want to not only welcome you, but also thank the ILO Statistics Department who is co-hosting this event with us today and without whom certainly this conversation would not be happening at all. So thank you so much to our colleagues at ILO for this. I thought it might be helpful for those of you who have not met us before, just to tell you, two sentences on who Data2X is and what we do. So Data2X is an organization that is based in the US, and we are a technical and advocacy platform that works to both improve and increase the production of gender data, but also its use. And so as you can imagine, the breadth of the gender data topic is one that means we span many different topics, certainly, but understanding the entirety of women's work burden is a particular challenge and is something when we set out in our own work in 2013 to really look across development domains and understanding the gender data gaps that existed, we certainly picked up on and saw quite clearly that in the realm of women's economic participation, that there were some quite glaring gaps that existed when compared to other development domains. And so we really took the opportunity to try to figure out where we might best be positioned to act. And so since 2014, that led to what has been a wonderful partnership with the ILO and with the World Bank, and also in the early days with the FAO as well. And we've been working with the ILO and the World Bank to try to meet this challenge of how do we better measure and understand women's work burdens. And we've been doing this work by pursuing methodological testing and piloting to inform the operationalization of the new definition of work agreed at the 19th ICLS. And in addition to this technical work and the work really of our technical colleagues at the ILO and the World Bank, another aspect of what Data2X is really quite focused on is trying to extend the conversation into different types of rooms. So being here in this room, and thank you so much to ILO for allowing us to be an observer here at ICLS. So having this conversation with all of those of you who are here and doing the very complicated work of labor statistics every day, but also trying to take this conversation into different rooms, into rooms where gender equality and women's empowerment is being discussed, into different policy tables, to try to translate what this work really means. So it's not only that it's a technical issue, but it's also a political issue. So how do we have the political will and the financing needed to prioritize this type of data collection in the first place? And then how do we turn that data collection into productive use from a policy standpoint? And I think we heard that really nicely highlighted in this morning's sessions on measuring informal employment from the delegate from Algeria. I don't know if she's here, but I thought she made a great point. So in this vein of having these conversations and bringing different people together, I'm really delighted to have the panel and the program that we have today. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to explain to you how this is going to go. So first, we are really honored to have Manuela Tomei here. She's director of the ILO's Conditions of Work and Employment Program, and she'll be giving opening remarks. Following her opening remarks, we'll hear from our colleagues from the ILO Statistics Department and the World Bank, who will do an overview of their methodological work to date, which has been done as a partnership with Data2X. And then after that, we will have a panel of data producers and users. And then after that, we will have hopefully ample time for questions for all of the presenters, including our ILO and World Bank colleagues. And then to close, we're really honored to have our colleague Ruth Levine from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, who is our thought partner in this work all the way, but she also is a donor from the Hewlett Foundation who has been supporting the work of Data2X really since day one. We wouldn't be here without her. So without further ado, I would like to invite Manuela Tomei to give her opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Is it a real pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward towards the discussion. I would like to start by quoting Melinda Gates. She once said that we cannot close the gender gap without closing the data gap. And I think this is really very telling. Because it says that the availability and the quality of data concerning the work and employment of women and men is key not only to monitoring trends in gender gaps at work, but they can also contribute to making a difference in the daily lives of women and girls on the ground. So in other words, data have really the power to bring about transformational change. And this is what you were referring to, right? The connection between data and policies, actions with a view to bringing about changes. So events like this one, and this is why I was so excited to take part in this panel, is that these are really a privileged moment in which you have the data producers and the data users like us that come together to understand each other's concerns and needs, and identify ways to reinforce each other's work in the interest of both users and producers, but most importantly, in the interest of women and girls in the world. So you were referring earlier on to the resolution that was adopted in 2019 by the 19th International Conference of Labor Statisticians on Statistics of Work, Employment, and Labor Utilization. And I would like to highlight how important that resolution is, because it really marked a turning point, not only in the way in which we conceive and define work in general, but also in terms of advancing the gender equality agenda and women's economic empowerment in particular. So it's really a turning point. It introduced a conceptually revolutionary definition of work, because indeed it includes but transcends work for profit or pay, and comprises, and I open quote, any activity performed by persons of any sex and age to produce goods or provide services for use by others or for one's own use. So by typifying for the first time unpaid care work as work, the resolution gives visibility and dignity to activities and tasks that historically have been carried out by women, that continue to be mainly performed by women, and that have been typically regarded of being of no or very little value. I think that this resolution really provides the foundation for a more comprehensive approach to capturing women's work and measuring the contribution to families' livelihoods, to the individual and societal well-being, besides also to economic growth. And this again is very relevant to today's debates about the future of work, in which indeed there is also a challenge to the concept of GDP, for instance, in terms of capturing indeed the wealth and well-being of countries. I would try to highlight, I mean, there are many policy implications originating from these resolutions, but there are two of them that I would like to highlight at this point. The first is that recognizing the performance of unpaid care work means that it has an impact on paid work, and that increases in paid work for women means replacing the unpaid work which has been displaced. So the ILO's recently released report on care work and care jobs for the future of work provides quite enlightening figures in that respect, and let me mention a few of them. we found out that over 16 billion hours are spent on unpaid care work every day across the world, which corresponds to 0.2 billion persons working 8 hours a day without remuneration. And if valued at the minimum wage, this would be equivalent to 9% of the global GDP. This is huge. Of these 16 billion hours, I mean, 2/3 of these 16 billion hours are performed by women. And when we take together paid and unpaid hours of work, the working days of women are longer than those of men. So this has obvious implications for also the current debates in which everybody is stressing the fact that bringing and retaining more women in the labor market makes sense also from an economic standpoint, especially in countries which are facing a contraction of populations due to rapid aging. So there is a sort of trade-off. How are we rebalancing it with a view to contributing to gender equality? Another major implication, I would say, is that this resolution broadens the universe of those entitled to work-related rights and benefits. And this has major implications for social protection policies. So these are just two of the consequences of this revolutionary resolution that you have all helped build and shape up. But of course, new standards in themselves do not translate automatically in new data. There is always a lag, a time lag, and it takes time for this to happen. Major efforts are needed. And certainly we cannot deny that there has been some progress since 2013, and I think that today's event is indeed going to be an opportunity to indeed showcase what has been done in terms of developing methodologies, testing methodologies, coming up with new tools with a view to providing guidance to support countries in a more accurate measurement of women's work. But I think, and this is my last message, is that there is need clearly to scale up, and that we need to move away from just pilot projects. So what does this entails, or what does this imply? That we definitely need to have more allies to join Data2X and the ILO in trying to bring this revolutionary resolution to indeed having very practical implications for the daily lives of women and girls across the world. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Manuela, for outlining those very specific examples and how it applies to women and girls, and also giving us a new term of art, revolutionary resolution. We'll see how that rolls off the tongue. So now I'm going to turn to colleagues from the ILO and the World Bank. I think everyone here has their fair share of experience of trying to work in partnership with others, and we all know that it can be challenging. And I could say on working on this revolutionary resolution and trying to push it further, that's really required very strong partnership and willingness of partners to collaborate. And I just want to underline that a point, because I think it's important to not take that for granted in terms of an initiative's success, and certainly its ability to scale up. So just really want to thank our partners for being so great to work with. So I just want to introduce them before they speak. So we have Kieran Walsh from the ILO Statistics Department, as well as Amparo Palacios Lopez and Isis Gaddis from the World Bank to present this work that they've been doing over the last 5 years to better measure women's work and employment. So Kieran, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I'm very conscious that I have more slides than minutes, so I will try to move quickly while remaining understandable. It's a challenge of time use. So I think everyone, based on what Emily and Manuela have said, should be clear on the importance of the latest standards and the importance of measurement different forms of work. But I want to give a brief history of gender mainstreaming in particular and statistics in the ILO. This has been an area of high priority for many years within the ILO. If you go back to 2003, at the 17th ICLS, a set of guidelines, a checklist of good practices for mainstreaming gender in labour statistics was produced, which didn't just stop at saying what you need is to have sex disaggregation of various indicators, but tried to give some additional guidance on what type of information, how to develop your system to give the range of information needed. Beyond that, gender mainstreaming has been incorporated in many capacity building activities. So it's been a very headline part of, for example, the Labour Market Statistics Academy, which we've been operating in recent years. The focus of this work is on ensuring that sufficient data is published to make visible work and labour market engagement and barriers for men and women. Okay, so it doesn't just stop at saying breaking down employment by sex or unemployment by sex. It looks at the range of information we really need to properly understand differences in work and labour market experiences. So that's been ongoing for years, but in and of itself was never going to be sufficient because there was a recognized bias in existing conceptual frameworks. The framework from 1982, which had a very wide focus in one sense because it had a wide definition of employment, also led to a massive undercounting of unpaid work. Even though theoretically it was identified as being in scope in some ways, most countries ignored its existence, to be frank, or else measured it infrequently, right, in favor of measuring employment and unemployment. So there was a bias that many people recognized that needed to be addressed. And to be based on the importance these standards have achieved over time, we were never going to close some of these data gaps unless we also closed this gap in our conceptual frameworks. So, 19th ICLS, Resolution 1, we've already heard a very good intro, so I won't spend much time on this. The proposed, the new standards were developed through a wide consultation and presented to the ICLS in October 2013. So the last ICLS adopted these standards. What are the key elements? As has already been mentioned, we have the first statistical definition of work and definitions for 5 different forms of work. So employment, obviously, is a critical element, now defined in a narrower way than it previously was as work for pay or profit. And then other forms of work, depending on who was gaining the benefit of the work, the output from it, and whether the work was paid or not, and what its purpose was. Okay, so this gave us our form of work framework. And in addition, we had additional labour underutilisation indicators because while wanting to measure the various working activities that people engage in, we also want to very well understand their engagement with the labour market. Okay, and we want to do this in a complementary, comprehensive way. So the 19th ICLS tried to address these various challenges within the new standards. So what are the implications of the 19th ICLS? Well, the positive side, when fully applied, we expect to have wider range of information available on different forms of work. Very simple, but very important. We expect to see greater visibility for many unpaid activities which were previously not being regularly measured. They were being measured in some countries, not at all in others, and measurement was often on an inconsistent basis. So comparability of these statistics was low, if not non-existent. We would have a better understanding of interaction with the labour market, in particular by combining the information on the work done and labour underutilisation. We get a proper picture of how people are interacting with the labour market and the barriers they face. But also, very importantly, and of great concern in this ICLS, we have seen concerns about the impact on indicators. What do we expect? Well, very clearly, we expect for many countries lower estimates of employment and higher levels of unemployment because the definitions have changed in such a way as people who were previously considered employed no longer are and may as a result be considered unemployed. Now, in implementing a framework of that type, the range of information you produce is critical. We cannot have a situation where we exclude people from employment who were previously measured as employed and they simply disappear. And we know nothing about what they're doing or what their engagement with the labour market is. So, that creates a major challenge for countries and for their system. So the implications for countries is that they need to develop a system to deliver these statistics, but we recognize no one source will be sufficient on its own. Countries will need to plan a system to deliver at different frequencies to meet national needs. So in other words, we don't expect every form of work to be measured every quarter, for example. It will be measured at different frequencies depending on the national demand. All of this will depend on what's available nationally in terms of sources and resources. But as we've recognized in this ICLS, there is a substantial need for support and guidance from countries to try and promote consistent and harmonized measurement. So in that context, what have we been doing? We have been testing over recent years to develop evidence-based guidance. So not just sitting in our offices saying what do we think are the right way to do things, but actually testing with partner countries to try and provide evidence. We have built up on accumulated national experience over decades of the best ways to undertake measurement. We have worked in partnership with 10 national statistical offices in one round of testing and others in another round, and with development partners including Data2X, for which we're very grateful. We have been working progressively to develop by different topics. For example, we started with employment and labour underutilisation, because these were of very high importance initially. But we've also been looking at the other forms of work on an ongoing basis. What is the gender relevance of this work? I probably don't even need to say it, but the provision of guidance, as we've heard at this conference, to ensure there is consistent, widespread, and harmonized measurement is critical. And so that's why we're working on this, and it has relevance to SDGs, Goal 5 and 8 in particular, but also others. Now, what do I want to highlight that comes from this? The first is the very simple, but the thing we can sometimes overlook methodologically, is what do we actually get when we apply this? And I've already mentioned it. Well, you get better information. Okay? So just from our pilot studies, if we look at one of our models, if we only had measured employment by the new standards, we would have seen higher participation rates among males and females, a persistent message that we get from many sources. But when we include own-use production of goods and own-use provision of services, where females are active more regularly than males, then you get a different picture. And overall, when you include all these forms of work, you've slightly higher levels of participation among women than men. Okay, but it's easy for us to miss that and talk about the methodologically interesting things, but this is what it's really about. Similarly, when we see hours worked, we can again see, if we only focus on employment, we see higher hours worked for males and females, but when we include the other forms of work, it reverses. Okay? And I would argue that by having those breakdowns, not just the totals, those breakdowns add value in themselves, because we understand in a better way what are the differences in participation of work and how they might influence labour market participation and various other things. Other points that we can note, there's higher performance of simultaneous activities among women, and many interesting patterns when we analyse barriers to labour market engagement. For example, higher percentage of women reporting that they are not engaging with the labour market because of family responsibilities. Okay, so this highlights the need for this type of measurement. When it comes to questionnaire design, very briefly, we noted very clearly a higher need for targeted recovery questions to capture women's employment. For different types of groups, contributing family workers, people with casual jobs, and cooperators in family businesses. Now I can highlight these very quickly with a couple of slides. This shows results from our pilot studies. On the left is men, on the right, women. And this is the number of questions which were needed to identify the full group of employed people. Now, if we just look at the very first line, that shows how many people were really quickly identified as employed. In other words, the first 1 or 2 questions. And among men, it's a higher percentage than women, right? We needed these small jobs recovery questions, these family helper recovery questions that were targeted at different types of work to make sure we fully captured women's employment to a greater extent than they were needed for men. So that's one important message. Another important message is that we had additional questions that target people who work in family businesses and initially report that they work unpaid. And that's fine, but it means that within international classifications, they'll simply be reflected as unpaid family workers, right? Whereas in reality, if you start asking questions about their role in the business, whether they make decisions for the business, you discover that the majority of those in this position are women. In other words, they initially report, I was helping unpaid in the family business, but then you find out they're making operational decisions on a regular basis. Okay? Now, under international classifications, they should be reclassified as own account workers or employers potentially. But there's this high risk of misrepresenting them. So what's our progress to date? We've done our pilot studies and we've published a range of reports in the first set of tools. We already highlighted these within the ICLS, so I won't go into them in any detail, but to say they are now there, model questionnaires and guidance to support countries in measurement. Our next steps, well, joint pilot study with World Bank in Sri Lanka. My colleagues in World Bank may also mention, this is a very important process to try and extend our guidance beyond labour force surveys, where we have been focused, to other types of household surveys, because in this way we will maximise the benefits of the guidance. We'll do further reporting from the pilot studies we've already done, for example, to come up with a very much a gender-focused report, implications for measurement, but also the value of the data. We're already started work on topics such as time use and volunteer work. And our overall aim, if I'm to give one overarching overall aim, is to identify measurement approaches which can be incorporated with labour force surveys at different frequencies. Okay, so things which we can observe to work efficiently and be possible to integrate in different sources through a modular approach. And also we'll have, we hope with our World Bank colleagues, some joint guidance on measurement of concepts through other types of household surveys. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Kieran. And now I will turn to Isis from the World Bank.
Okay. There's a folder open, maybe.
Okay, so this will be a joint presentation with my colleague Amparo, who's sitting on the right. I'll take the first part and then she'll take over. So just a little bit on the background. I think the previous speakers have already alluded to the fact that the 19th ICLS really provides an opportunity to reevaluate the measurement of work, particularly for women, and there is a strong new emphasis on better measurement of all forms of work, including unpaid activities, which is very welcome, particularly if you look at work and employment from a gender perspective. Just to add a little bit to that from the perspective of the World Bank, I think there was, and that's something we really have encountered as we work on this partnership and as we interact with other teams at the bank, there's an increasing concern amongst World Bank operational staff that as of today, women's participation in the labor market is often not adequately captured by standard survey instruments. And we have a couple of examples from South Asia, Honduras, where teams are coming to us and say, we see this pattern of low or declining female labor force participation. We really want to understand that better. Is it real? Are we not properly capturing the various types of activities that women are doing? And so this also provides for us an opportunity to interact with those teams and try to help them improve their understanding of the labor market. And behind all this is the notion that if we do not get the diagnosis right, then maybe the policy response may also not be adequate. If we think that women are generally not engaged in any form of employment, then maybe we try to bring them closer to the labor market, but perhaps we're just missing some of their employment they're actually doing, and maybe there are other factors that are constraining them. So also from a policy perspective, this is very relevant. And then, of course, as we started to interact in the context of this partnership, there was this notion that perhaps the 19th ICLS employment definition, which is a narrower concept of employment, may affect men and women differentially related to gender roles in agriculture, where women and men may be working on different types of crops and report different intended uses of the output of their work. So what has been sort of the progress since the 19th ICLS? And Kieran has already talked about that. We have initiated with Data2X and World Bank and also FAO, the Women's Work and Employment Partnership. On the side of the World Bank, during the first phase of this partnership from 2015 to 2017, we conducted 2 pilot studies in Ghana and Malawi. These were not nationally representative studies on our end. These were relatively focused, I mean, we visited 2 or 3 regions or districts in these countries, so they were a bit smaller in scope, I would say, than some of the ILO pilot studies. And now, currently, under the second phase, we're working on a pilot study together with the Sri Lankan Department of Census and Statistics, and we're very delighted having 2 colleagues from Sri Lanka also here at the event today and at the ICLS. And of course, this work wouldn't be possible without Data2X and Hewlett Foundation, for whom we're very grateful for the support and funding they're providing. What are the objectives, broadly speaking? So we want to improve measurement of male and female labor in multi-topic household surveys. This includes living standard measurement study surveys, which are supported by the World Bank, but also more broadly, any type of household income and expenditure type survey. And especially, we're interested, not exclusively, but especially in labor and agriculture, where we see that agricultural employment most likely is going to be most affected by the new ICLS standard, but also where, in general, we have some measurement challenges, even in the past. We want to align household survey labor modules with new LFS practices that not only includes the new employment definition, but also more broadly the design and formatting of the new LFS model questionnaires, which we want to get as close as possible together, right? Because if you think of it from the perspective of a more integrated labor system, ideally these types of surveys can complement each other. So we want as much as possible be close to what they are getting on the labor force survey side. We are also exploring the use of new technologies for measuring physical activity and understanding gender differences. This is really cutting-edge research where we are really just sort of trying, in terms of proof of concept studies, trying to see what can we do with measuring physical activity, for example, using accelerometers, and my colleague Amparo will talk about that at the end of this presentation. And then, of course, ultimately, where do we want to go? We want to develop guidelines on labor measurement. On our side, particularly focusing on multi-topic household surveys, but again, closely aligned with the guidelines of the ILO on labor force surveys. And then we want to disseminate these guidelines and the best practice standards and support countries in the implementation. What have been some of the challenges from our side in operationalizing the 19th ICLS? So on data collection, really, if you think about the new, and here I'm focusing a bit on the new employment definition, there are, of course, the resolution was broader than that, but particularly related to the new concept of employment. We need to test the boundary between employment and own use production work, which is, according to the resolution, based on the intended destination of production. This sounds relatively straightforward in principle. In practice, this is actually very complicated because we're dealing with people often engaged in agriculture production. So at what level even do we want to assess the boundary? Do we want to assess the total production, so a farmer who produces beans and maize and cassava? Do we want to look at his overall production basket, so to speak, and assess how much of that is intended to be sold and versus own consumed? Or do we look at clusters of production activities such as farming versus livestock versus fisheries? Or do we look at single products like maize, beans, milk, and byproducts, of course? So these are some of the more practical challenges. And then once we define the level at which we want to assess the boundaries, then also you have to come up with a threshold. Is it 50%, 30%, and so on? And then just very briefly, because we're a bit time constrained, but there is this element of making a transition. So we have a new concept, and all of you, or many of you, are labor statisticians, so we're always concerned about having a break in time series and communicating that and helping data users understand that the previous concept of labor force participation, employment are not entirely comparable to the data we're getting with the new concept. And there's this issue also about linking sort of labor statistics to national accounts. At the bank, for instance, our macroeconomists very routinely feed estimates of employment by sector into macro models where then they compute estimates, for instance, of sectoral labor productivity. Now we have own use production of goods, which is no longer included under employment, but it's still included as production on the national account side. So again, this is something that needs to be managed. I'm not going to have a lot of time to go very deep into all the findings from this work, but I'll just want to give you a few highlights. What we do see both from the 2 labor experiments we conducted in Ghana and Malawi, and again, bear in mind, these are not nationally representative surveys, these are relatively small-scale surveys, but also from a couple of actually nationally representative surveys that we have supported at the World Bank, we do see that agriculture employment declines under the 19th ICLS standard. That is to be expected because it's a narrower concept of employment. But we do see the magnitude also differs quite a lot. Initially, we worked on Ghana, and Ghana is, at least the areas in Ghana where we worked were relatively market-oriented. Other parts of Africa have lower level of market orientation. So there we expect really employment in agriculture to decline much more drastically. Not all of these farmers necessarily will drop out of the labor force. They may be doing secondary activities, which still will then route them back into the employed population, but this is only looks at their agricultural employment. In all the countries where we have done this analysis, women employment in agriculture declines disproportionately, but sometimes the gender differences are very small. For instance, you see here in the labor experiment in Malawi, where we see both 22% of male and female farmers reported that they are producing for sale or for pay or profit. So there the gender difference is really very small and probably wouldn't meet statistically significant standards. In other countries, the gap is larger, but the point estimate tends to be lower for women than for men, which signals that women are more likely to say that they are engaged in own-use production of goods in agriculture. And I'll have my colleague Amparo continue.
As it was mentioned by Isis, the survey unit of the World Bank has a research agenda, a methodological agenda, in which we are trying to find new methods that are at the edge, very far away, that are that are very new, that improve and simplify the methods, the way we collect data, with the idea to streamline and to bring them to the national statistical offices. Among them, we have several, and this we have been, when we started working on the 19 ICLS implementation, we were working on labor in agriculture. And there is, on the labor community, on the agricultural economics community, there is the knowledge that the total number of hours that comes from surveys that is put into the season for production of crops is very limited. It's a very bad number, so we don't understand if it's overestimating or underestimating. So we did this type of experiment in which we visited the farmers every week, and every week we asked them how many hours they worked on the plot. To each member of the household, we also collected different types of data. We have two countries for now, Tanzania and Ghana, and what we can see is that recall method, when we ask traditionally, as in any household survey or any agricultural survey at the end of the season, how many hours did you work on working on the farm, totally overestimate the number of hours at the plot person level, so at the individual level. So we have to be clear that this is at the plot person level, but it has implications. It has implications on productivity, especially from the gender aspect. So recall methods overestimate the hours per person per plot, but doesn't capture the other thing that we understood is that there are many persons that are not captured. Household members marginally involved in agriculture often are not captured in this type of surveys, especially women, but also many plots that are marginal and that may not be the main area in which the household is focusing. We have also experimented, as Isis mentioned, with new technologies, and because we think that new technologies can provide further insights, but of course they will require still more testing. In this case, we experimented with accelerometers in Malawi. So we gave an accelerometer to a person in a household, a man and a female, and they had to have it for 10 days. We partnered with the expert of the University of California. And just, of course, this chart may not say much, but we can see from it that women do more light activity, but spend less time sedentary. And men, they do more medium and vigorous activity, but they are more sedentary. So women work in different activities that may not require huge levels of effort, but it's throughout the day. And men will work in hard activities for shorter periods of time, and then will just simply sit down. Of course, that's something that of course, just a number like that is difficult just to bring. So we are combining that we are combining the new methods with traditional technologies. And this is linked to what Elisa just presented at the plenary that has to do with time use. And so we also fill the traditional time use surveys. And what we can see here is, again, nothing new to us. It's like in this study in Malawi, women devote more time to unpaid work. And we can see cooking, fetching water, looking after children, cleaning. But men devote more time to social and economic activities. So they go to the farm, but they also participate more, a lot more, in social or religious activities. So this is just some of the research that we are still pushing. This is very new. We still need to do a lot of more work on that. So what's the relevance for development policy maker of all of this? Of course, understanding women's and men's work is critical for the success of development policies. That's what we all know, and that's why we are all here. As we said, the 19th ICLS has allowed to provide more nuanced labor market information to policymakers, and we know that better measurement of time spent on unpaid activities can document women's labor constraints and time poverty. And that's something that we need to research and dedicate much more resources and time. The partnership on women's work and employment has resulted in better coordination across agencies. And as Emily mentioned, it has been a great partnership. We have had very close and very fast feedback among ourselves, and has resulted in harmonizing survey instruments and supporting the design of a statistical system directly to the countries. So the next steps, of course, is finalizing the Sri Lanka pilot study jointly with our colleagues that graciously accepted the challenge to working with us, develop technical guidelines for multi-topic household surveys in close coordination with ILO, so it will be a joint output, and disseminate best practice standards and support countries in the implementation, again, jointly with ILO. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters, and thanks for the photos as well at the end. I'd like to invite you all to return to your seats. There's some seats in the front for you, or there should be. I'm going to invite our second panel to now come up to the podium. You can also sit on the side if you're missing seats. I think there's enough here. So I would like to invite Dr. Lisa Bersales from the National Statistician of the Philippines. And Lisa, you'll be sitting right there. Thank you. And Dr. Hanna Sutela, the senior researcher at Statistics Finland, who will be sitting here to my left. Ms. Eloisa Pulido, who's Director General of Labor Statistics at the Ministry of Labor in Mexico. And Ms. Sylvie Derer, who is Director of the Federal Office for Gender Equality of Switzerland. So this is quite an interesting panel. We have one that kind of really stretches across the data production and use value chain. We have from NSOs to data producers within ministries to policymakers. So we're really, the point and the purpose behind this particular panel and discussion is trying to take us from production to use and trying to, influence more of these types of conversations happening in the world. So the way this is going to work is that each panelist will have, do you need some help? Do you need help? Oh, okay. We'll have a short initial presentation to share their reflections on their own experiences and their work. So there'll be 5-minute interventions, and then after that, I'll kind of see how we're doing on time. We're running a little over, so I was planning to have a moderated discussion, but if we're getting tight, then I'll just turn it to the floor because I'm sure there's some stimulating commentary that's waiting from all of you sitting here. So with that, I would like to invite Lisa to address the group.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you for Data2X for inviting me, and of course, ILO. The Philippines has always recognized gender issues as very important in our country. So it's a political issue in the country. We have a Magna Carta for women. We have a lot of very active women NGOs that look into women's concerns. And because of this, there is much demand for data, information, and specifically statistics from various sectors, but specifically from the Philippine Statistical System and the NSO, the Philippine Statistics Authority in particular. So we actually, to address this demand, the PSA compiles every March of each year, we update this compilation of fact sheet on women and men. And this is in celebration of the March National Statistics Women's Month in the country. So I'd just like to show you very, very quickly what this is about. You can just please take a look at this in our website, psa.gov.ph. But this actually has, so every March we give this particular report. And for this year, March 2018, we already have 84 indicators covering 14 socioeconomic sectors and gender concerns. And we have in here the women and men fact sheet, which we have been providing since 2012. And we are subscribing to the Open Data Platform. I'm looking at Shada. So we are trying our best to be subscribe to Open Data. And so I will just show you, please, the latest Excel file of this fact sheet. And I will focus on the the Excel file has, I'm very sorry, we have a very small font, but it has 4 pages, and it has various sections. So we have the usual demographics, we have health and nutrition, education. In the Philippines, women and girls are really doing well in terms of education statistics, but I would like to focus on work and economic participation. So we have noticed that women have less labor participation in the past 3 years. I'm thinking why. It's really because more of our girls now are in school. More girls in the Philippines are in school than boys. So that's really where we are now. And, but we've also provide here the proportion of unpaid family workers. There are more of this for the women than for the men. And so this is actually what the Philippines wants to look into, this unpaid work. I would like to report that the Philippines really appreciates ILO and other international agencies helping countries on standards and measurements, instruments, better ways of measuring and dissemination. And so after the 19th ICLS, we actually, in 2016, we did a pilot of 2 modules for the labor force survey. This is in collaboration with the ILO. And we also did, in 2017, a pilot of unpaid work. And for this year, we actually started already with the unpaid care work. And we did it in the April round of our labor force survey. We do the labor force survey quarterly, and we decided that for certain rounds, we will focus on some modules. So for the April 2018, we did unpaid care work. So these really are some efforts we're doing to subscribe to the 19th ICLS resolution, but at the same time to address the needs of our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It'd be great to also to understand how, you know, how many people, and if there's any tracking too of how many people are accessing the fact sheet, and you know, just to sort of understanding some of the metrics around that as well, perhaps as a next step. I will just, oh, there we go. Okay, so Hanna, we will turn it to you. Many of you might know, Finland has really a long history of data-driven decision-making, and so we really wanted to hear more about their perspective and the role of communication between data producers and users.
Okay, thank you. So I guess this was a reason given why I'm invited here, or Finland is invited here, and so I thank you for this opportunity. So the data which was referred here to, what makes a kind of a basis for our gender policy making, I could think of a time use survey, labor force survey, which it's ad hoc models. This year it's on work and family. It's EU ad hoc model, but we extended it with some national policy need questions. Quality of work-life surveys, and gender equality barometer. So what do you need to collect good quality data? So I assume that if the basic infrastructure is okay and there are enough resources to do good work, I would say that the most essential is the good communication and networking. And I mean with outside, with external stakeholders, but also within your NSO, because it's so too often it happens that something is done in your office next to you and you are not aware of that. And combining, I think, networking within the NSOs is also very important. And I would like, what was also referred in Kieran's presentation, I think it's very important also to go into the field, or I mean to be in contact with the outside world. It's not enough just to sit in the office, because it's really essential to follow your time and to reach outside. For instance, when we have a new survey or this time a new topic, like in Quality of Work Life survey, we wanted to grasp digitalization of work. We didn't have much clue about what it really means in everyday, in different occupations, in different people. So we started with qualitative interviews, going to people and hearing their stories and interviewing them. So and listening to the language they used. So in order to be able to operationalize questions which are feasible and understandable for people. And of course, then you have the testing, which is also important. But so what about the communication and dialogue? So what can it mean between data producers and data users? So I think a very good way what we do is are the expert groups. We have some permanent expert groups in Statistics Finland with outsiders for gender statistics and for labor market statistics. So there are experts for Statistics Finland, but then there are people from different ministries and different stakeholders. They meet once or twice a year to go over, the policy needs and what should be done and so on, and what is done. But also when we start a new survey or a new ad hoc module or whatever, so we build up an expert group for that service, so where we invite stakeholders from ministries, universities, research institutes, social partners, just to hear their policy needs and so to make clear that we do some relevant things and to hear their prior experiences. And yeah, there's also something else for this cooperation. It's very expensive, as we all know, to do surveys, good quality surveys of sufficient size, what you can really use for different reasons. So what we do, if different stakeholders who are in need of this information, if they come in with some amount of money, so together that will make enough to make a survey of sufficient size. And of course they have set advantages, they can participate in the expert group, but we very much want to make the emphasis that they don't, with that co-funding, they don't kind of buy or order any convenient survey results or even questions for them. But it's something really which I think is also a very good method. And lastly, I would like to emphasize that as a data producer, I think it's also very important that you profile, or at least some of you data producers among you profile as experts, take part actively also in the public debate. And of course, we can't do it, we can't take any strong political stand to anything because we don't want to compromise our credibility as a neutral data producers. But I still think it is important, it's our responsibility to try to interpret for the data users the figures, that not just, presenting the figures, but to say that, look, they highlight some trends worth noticing, or making the associations with other phenomena in the society. And as an expert also, you have better chances to be invited in these working groups in policy making, which gives a good opportunity to make an impact with your figures, with your statistics. Thank you.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much, Hanna. And I really like your point about I think it's very important that, for this topic, as for data producers and statisticians, I speak here as someone who's very interested in data and its use, but I am not personally a statistician, to try to find better ways of highlighting the work that statisticians are doing, right? And some of that, I think, is these voices of all these people in this room being more known and understood for what you're doing every day. It's quite hard work, and I think trying to demystify some of that helps increase the relevance for user audience as well. So now I'm really happy to introduce Ms. Eloisa Pulido, and this was quite a purposeful invite because she has an interesting position as Director of Labor Statistics, but within the Ministry of Labor. And so just by virtue of her role, she's trying to combine both the role of data producer, but sitting within the data user agency. So very much look forward to hearing your perspective.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank you for this invitation, so to be part of this space of iteration and dialogue. Let me introduce myself a little bit. I am an official of the Statistical Division of the Ministry of Labor in Mexico. My job has been to build up alongside our colleague of INEGI, which is Mexico's National Statistical Office, statistical capacities addressing topics that matters in terms of analysis of the labor market, but also some other areas of interaction between labor and societal uses. One concrete consequence of the Beijing Conference in 1994 in statistical capacities was at the first launch of the Time Use Survey in 2002, followed by two more rounds in 2009 and 2014. Beijing Conference also had consequences in the reformulation of Mexico's labor force survey in 2005. The design of the surveys goes beyond the scope related to the labor force, also on the reasons on why persons leave a job. The dissemination of data includes information on paid domestic workers on a quarterly basis, as well on both informal sector and informal employment, with the same regularity. Not less important, it was added in it a section on time spent in activities that before the 19 ICLS were not considered as work. The combination of levels of activity coming from the time use survey with some short-term data on non-paid activities, providing services to household-owned consumptions, allows the construction of the not remunerated domestic work satellite account from where it's obtained and estimate the total amount of activity in potential transaction. This type of work accrues which is an equivalent of more than 23% of the GDP. The weight of the information of the last decade included a module on child labor in the labor force survey, but also the cross-sectional gender perspective uses, gave the inception of specialized surveys on gender violence, and most recently, in 2017, was launched a survey of different kinds of discrimination, including labor discrimination. We can say that in the last 20 years, Mexico has been invested in building up statistical infrastructure, where gender uses were moving more and more from the margins to the center of the statistical undertaking. Alongside this statistical infrastructure and with institutionalization of information production and dissemination, a frame of dialogue between different branches of federal government and statistical producer and integrator has been in motion. The National on Statistical and Geographic Information is that institutional setting where both topics and new needs of information are introduced and considered or not of national interest. The information of national interest must have 4 rules, being one of the most relevant uses in the country, among others, employment and work, be necessary for the design and evaluation of public policies with national scope, being generated regularly and periodically, and being elaborated with a scientifically supported methodology. The National System of Statistical of Geographic Information is organized through specialized committees with representatives of the government units responsible for implementing of public policies in specific ambits, such as education, health, macroeconomics, gender, employment, and work, etc. These committees work in the design of new statistical products and indicators, also in the consolidation and improvement of the already existing statistics. Thank you.
Thank you. This is really helpful to hear how some of the practicalities around how the different units are working together. So finally, I'm very delighted to have Ms. Sylvie Durer here to present her perspective as a policymaker on the best strategies to ensure that data can be integrated into policy cycles, how it can be made more policy relevant, and perhaps some examples of how data on women's work has impacted policy here in Switzerland from our host country.
Thank you very much. So, dear organizers, dear panelists, dear participants, first let me thank you for the invitation, but above all for having set up this event on a major issue. The dialogue between statisticians and policymakers is essential. In Switzerland, both paid and unpaid work are part of the indicators used by the government to analyze the gender equality situation and to check the achievement of our national goals as well as our contribution to the SDGs. We think it is essential to address both paid and unpaid work to achieve gender equality. It is a question of justice towards women, but also a question of social cohesion and of sustainable economic prosperity. Let me now highlight an important example of policy making related to paid work. In Switzerland, there is currently a revision process of the Federal Act on Gender Equality, which, if it succeeds, will bring all employers, public and private, having 100 and more employees to carry out an equal pay analysis every 4 years and to publish the result. This proposal of a new law has been made possible after a long process in which statistics have played a very important role. Indeed, we have an important tool with the Swiss Earnings Structure Survey. This survey and some deeper analysis it allows gives us a lot of information about the gender pay gap. This information has been used to call an action on the part of politicians and companies. It shows, for instance, that in 2010, there was an average gap of about 20% and that about 40% of this difference is not explained. It showed that this unexplained part of gender pay gap is of about 7% in Switzerland. For a long time, we had all these depressing data and a lot of others. For instance, it means also 600 francs per month, which is lacking women, and so on. So we had really a lot of data. However, we didn't manage to bring employers and politicians to do something about it until we changed a little bit our perspective. My office asked our statistical office to estimate what 7% amounts to in Swiss francs for the whole economy. And they came up with a number of 7 billion francs for a year. Suddenly, when we spoke about 7%, about 600 francs, it was always a private issue, it was a peanuts issue. And then when we came up with a different perspective, 7 billion francs every year, it wasn't any longer a private issue, it was a public issue, and which required action on the part of the government and on the part of the parliament. This is why one of the issues for my office is not only to have data and statistics, but also to have the good numbers. To have the numbers which are going to speak to politicians, if it's our target. In fact, as a Swiss policymaker, I face 3 challenges. First, I need the right order of magnitude to express the importance of gaps and inequalities. In this perspective, we need different approaches. We need a whole set of numbers. And this set of numbers is not always the same according to the country and to the political context and so on in which you are working. Second, I need clear and high quality data which makes sense in this field for employers too, which they can use for their own purpose, their own internal action aiming at equal pay. In our case, it is the same data, for instance, which companies have to send the Office for Statistics and which they can use in the context of public procurement where they have to show that they respect equal pay for work of equal value. It is also the same data they can use for a tool which we have developed, which is called Logib, and which helps companies to make a self-check. So it's very important because then companies know that they have to send this data to the statistical office. They are complied to by law, but also they have really an internal need because it costs a lot of money to get data, you know that, so that's why it's so important that themselves understand and can make a good use of it. Third, I also have to make sure that the published data is communicated and understood in the right way. For instance, publishing sector-specific salaries in given activities can be problematic if they are used for setting compensation. And we know that it is the case in Switzerland. We have also companies which are using these data in order to set salaries, although these data show inequalities and show a situation which is eventually forbidden by law. This is why it's so important that statisticians stay clear that explaining doesn't mean justifying, a confusion which is often made. We have to be very thoughtful about our wording and always try to find easy to understand concepts. And there, I think we still have some work to do. A last few words. Do not compromise your neutrality. It's what we can read here. It's what our colleague said. Yes, but don't avoid your responsibilities in this field. Be open for dialogue, and I'm very happy that you are so numerous here today because I think we have to work together. We all have to achieve gender equality. It's not only offices for gender equality or ILO. I think you have to play your part in this game. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you to this wonderful panel, and 7 billion francs, that's quite a figure. I can imagine that motivates action. So I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask, but I'd rather just turn to, since we're a little running behind, to our audience to see if you have questions. And if you don't, that doesn't let anyone off the hook, because I have some in the can, as it were. You can also direct questions to our first panel as well, and they can speak from their microphones. Yes, I see the gentleman in the back.
Okay, thank you.
If you could introduce yourself, just who you are and what office you're from, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm James Byiringiro. I work for the National Statistics Office of Rwanda. My question is related to the presentation made previously on working or in agriculture. Just there is a presentation on employment in agriculture, where it was said that due to the new international standards, the agriculture people in agriculture, the number of people, the proportion of people in agriculture was declined. Now, if you look on the international classification, they have as a consequence to spread people engaged in agriculture in different categories. Some are in employment, others are in unemployment, and others are in outside the labor force. Now, I want to comment on those terminology that we use. For instance, if we say that the proportion of people in agriculture was declined, while we are referring to employment, I think that this may be misunderstood. because in reality, people in agriculture was not declined. They are still working in agriculture, but the problem is that we are considering the narrowing population. We are looking on those who are involved in market-oriented agriculture. So I think that we have to be careful in the way that we use terms. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. I'll take a couple of questions before turning it to panelists. Are there any other? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Ephraim Kusigaba from Tanzania. We heard from various research that women talk too much. Well, men talk once and women talk too much, maybe thrice as much. And we heard that from the previous slides that women are working simultaneous work while women work in economic activity at once. So there is a need of a study why women talk too much 3 words while men talk once, and women are doing simultaneous work at the same time. But that's not the case. What I'm trying to say is that we need to investigate about the measurement of simultaneous work at the same time. That's very important to me. The issue is that maybe we need something like assigning what we call weights in each activity so that we can get the value of the work within maybe 24 hours. I am talking about the time used in these activities. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And maybe we can speak with 3 words and do that simultaneously while juggling several other things. I don't know. We can look into that. Are there any other questions before I turn it to colleagues? Yes, I'll take this last one and then we'll do the round.
My name is Yelena Zarova. I represent the Moscow city government. And so my question is to Ms. Sylvia Durer. If possible, the effect of glass ceiling is well known, and it has not only the social but also the medicine reasons. And do you take into account this effect of glass ceiling for women when you forecast the economic growth and the factor of employees, influence of this factor and gender inequality in forecasting of your economic growth? Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that question, and to all 3 of you. So I think for the first question from our colleague from Rwanda on the way that the agriculture piece was referred to, I'll turn that to colleagues from the World Bank. They're sitting right up here, if you can't see them.
Thank you. So yes, I think this is an important point. I mean, what we try to say here is that under the new standards, you will have lower levels of employment in agriculture, but it is important to distinguish between what is a material change in the economy once you disseminate the new results and what is sort of a method-driven measurement change, right, which is not reflecting of any transitions out of agriculture. So yeah, I think this is a very important point, and this is part of the challenges what we talked about when we mentioned the transition, right, that you have a new employment concept which will deliver lower numbers of people being employed in agriculture, but we have to be very clear, this is not a sign of accelerated structural transition or any material change in the economy. This is really a different measure of employment that we are working with here.
Thanks. So Kieran Walsh from ILO. Just to complement that, I think the most important thing is not to falsely represent things as trends. This is not a trend. I mean, this is a change in the way we measure. And the most important thing is that we measure and represent what are people actually doing. And I think this also relates to what Tanzania raised, is it's critical that through our surveys, we don't just focus on the absence of activity, we focus on what they're doing, because everyone is doing something. We mightn't capture all of it through surveys, but they are doing something. And in the case of agriculture, what we would want to see is that the statistics that are published show how many people are employed in agriculture, and how many people are engaged in own use production work in agriculture. And that this, in countries where that's an important phenomenon, both of those things are highlighted as key indicators. Okay, so it should never be the case, we would hope, that we simply have in one period 80% employment to population ratio and in the next period 20% and no explanation of what that gap is. Because it isn't a trend and it should never be represented as a trend. Well, some element of it can be a trend, but you need to produce the information to represent it properly. And I just want to mention the issue of burden here, because I think we have to be very conscious that if we try to measure all of these activities and a lot of information about labour underutilisation, we can have very heavy surveys. We've heard this mentioned in the conference. So coming back to one of my points is we need to promote the idea of a system of surveys or sources that generate statistics over a period of time, not just one. And we need to do it in a coherent way so that we can look across those sources and draw meaningful conclusions, not just saying, well, this one source gave me an estimate of employment, this other source gave me an estimate of own use production work, but I can't really bring them together. Okay, and all of that takes work. It takes a careful design of surveys, and that's what we want to continue to work on in the future, is, for example, through this project in Sri Lanka, to say, well, if I'm measuring in a living standards measurement survey or other type of poverty survey or expenditure survey, and I have that once every 5 years, and in between I have a labour force survey, well, how do I use those sources together? Mm-hmm. What can I understand from them? Because that's the future. I mean, we can't, any of us say the future is only going to be a country running all labour force surveys, or a country is only going to run time use surveys, or a country is only going to run poverty surveys. That can't be the future. So that's the gap we're trying to close, to make sure that we highlight the multiple activities people engage in properly. Mm-hmm. And where possible also, that there are simultaneous activities that we know are taking place that are difficult to measure and difficult to highlight properly. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Great, and Kieran, while you're, I mean, I think you've started answering a bit the question from our colleague from Tanzania as well on simultaneous measurement of work, which is certainly highlighted in your presentation, but perhaps you could give us a little bit more on that.
So, I mean, look, we can have a variety of different strategies for trying to measure simultaneous activities. You can do a certain amount through labour force surveys, right? So, for example, trying to highlight the multiple, if people have multiple jobs, trying to capture information on more than just one job, right? That's a starting point. And trying to also, if it's important in your country, capture information on work in agriculture, own use production work in agriculture, so that you can already see this simultaneity, right? So you can see the combined number of hours people are working across forms of work, for example. Now, there will be limitations on the ability to capture all forms of work in one survey, right? So that's where we come back to the need for multiple sources. This is where time use surveys can be very important, for example, because in a short period of time, they will capture all of the activities done, not just productive activities, other ones. So we need to have a good strategy across sources of information to maximize the efficiency of our system. But I would say in labour force surveys, as a minimum, where particularly agricultural activities are important, we would certainly promote the idea that on a regular basis, employment and own use production of goods as a minimum should both be measured and reported on, at least that much.
Thank you. And for the last question, I'll turn to Sylvie.
Well, as I said, in Switzerland, the main issue is really fighting gender gap with a special focus, emphasis on fighting the unexplained part, where the responsibility lies, especially by employers. But the glass ceiling is also an important issue. And at all levels, I would say, at the national, at the company's level, and also at the individual levels. So at the national level, Switzerland is facing a lack of labor force, so it's very important that we have women at all levels in a company, because we know, so we have a lot of evidence in this field that if you have a certain diversity, you have a better chance to have better ideas, to be more innovative, and to be more aware eventually of the different risks companies has to face. So it's an important issue, and there we try to support different projects in order to improve the situation. At the employers level, as I said, we strongly encourage companies companies to make an analysis in order to find the unexplained part. But with the tool which we have developed, very often companies see that they don't only have a problem with unexplained part, but they have a problem with the labor force, labor work, and that they have a lot of women who have a very good education and their own, but they don't get to the different levels. And so when they see this, they see they are wasting to a certain extent their labor force, and they should do better. So it goes much further than the issue of fighting the unexplained part. And then at the individual level, women can go to the court if they want to, because they eventually they haven't been promoted, or they haven't been hired for a certain position because of the glass ceiling, as you mentioned it. But then we know that it's very difficult for women to go to court and to have their discrimination being recognized. That's why we are targeting at other perspectives, because it's so difficult for individuals.
Is there one question? Is there any last question before we turn? Okay, I see no hands. I will just say the question that I really wanted to ask that I did not get a chance to ask, but I actually would like to ask this question of everyone in the room. So I'll be here today, I'll be here tomorrow. I might come up to you and ask this randomly, so I'm just giving you advance notice, which is, this is very hard work, what's being, the challenge that's posed with these new definitions. This is hard work, it's an investment to do this work. And I'm really interested not only in the panelists' perspectives, but all of your perspectives on, really what are the most important insights that this new framework can give about women's work that should motivate, the work that would go into producing, and aligning with the framework in the first place. So what are those things that, you can be saying, that you do say within your own context to kind of make the case for this? And if not, or if that's very hard to make that case, why? I would love to hear more about that from all the brain power that's here in this room and on the stage. So with that, though, I will thank our second panel for their contributions and their insights. Very grateful to have such a representation of countries and experience. And would like to invite our colleague Ruth Levine from the Hewlett Foundation for closing remarks. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is really inspiring to be here, and I really appreciate the chance to take maybe 5 minutes or so to maybe reflect on what we've heard today and kind of the broader conversation around measuring informality and the time use and the challenges that labor statisticians have in anticipating and responding to not just current policy questions, but those that we imagine for the future and want to be ready to answer. Like Emily, I'm not a statistician myself. I am married to one, but and I respect the work greatly of that you all do. As I was listening to both this morning's plenary and then the session today, I was really thinking about relationships. And those relationships are around methods and policies and institutions. So let me just speak briefly about each of those. I think in the methodological domain, we've really recognized the relationship between how economic activity is measured and how societies value different kinds of economic activity. And we're really confronting this in a very direct way, trying to eliminate or at a minimum reduce gender bias and what I will also call modernization bias, because I think the refined ways we have to measure formal activity and the still developing ways we have to measure informal activity really reflect a kind of, there's probably a better word, but a modernization bias that increasingly is seen to be not really appropriate for the world that's on its way. I think increasingly industrialized countries will have to learn how to measure informal activity. So that's one kind of relationship that we have recognized. And the other is the relationship between, that we have to strengthen between how we measure in different kinds of data sources. So the work that has been done to harmonize across labor force surveys and multi-topic household surveys is incredibly important to optimize the investments that we make. So that's on the methodological side. On the policy side, people have spoken to the value of looking at trends in employment and in own-use production of goods. I think that some of the key policy uses really have to do with using the data to better understand some core relationships. So for example, how is the structure of employment related to the potential for domestic resource mobilization, for taxation? Is it the case that men are actually overtaxed relative to women? What's the relationship between the way a government could spend money and the potential for job creation? We've supported some research that has shown really very, very dramatically that $1 spent in subsidized childcare generates far more jobs, both by freeing up the time for mothers to enter the workforce and for employing childcare workers, than, for example, $1 spent in some kinds of infrastructure. That sort of research is not possible without the kind of statistical information that you all are working so hard on. And then just one more example on the policy front, what is the relationship between economic activity and social protection? How can governments use their regulatory and other levers to, for example, close the pension gap between men and women, which right now is estimated to be about 30 to 40%, despite the fact that women live longer, but they have far less pension resources. So those are real questions that governments have to face and can only really answer intelligently with the kind of information that's provided by the work you do. And then finally, I'll close with many, many thanks by highlighting perhaps the most important kind of relationship, which is that among people. And what we've seen here today is not just collaboration among the International Labor Organization, the World Bank, and Data2X, and we should never minimize the challenges of having large international organizations with many, many different interests behind them work together. So there's an institutional relationship, but I think even more what I know to be the case is that there's been a real professional relationship that has been forged by working together that I'm sure will yield many, many benefits, including in the relationships between those organizations, the World Bank and the ILO, and national statistics offices, because at the end of the day, as you know better than I do, all of this is not possible without extraordinary work by national statistics offices. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. Do you want to? I'm going to turn it to you for the final.
Okay. No, thank you so much for that, Ruth. And yes, she always has a way of framing the issue and really helping us think through all of the different kind of elements of what it takes to do this work, but also I think the benefits that can accrue as we all work together. So I just want to thank all of you for coming, for being here with us, for the time and attention that you're putting into these really critically important measurement issues, which have certainly undoubtedly an impact on women, but also on men. And think about that question that I posed at the end. Would love to get your insights and really look forward to ongoing work with each of you. So thank you.